Hello, everyone. Tonight, our stories are about the ghosts who refuse to be forgotten, the killers who are not content to commit their crimes in the shadows, but who insist on becoming a part of their own legend. We'll begin with a man who was more than just a murderer. He was a performer, a puzzle maker, and a phantom who turned an entire city into a terrified audience for his macabre theater. He gave himself a name and a symbol, a chilling cross-circle sign that became a mark of pure, random terror. He communicated with the police and the press through a series of taunting letters and cryptic ciphers, playing a deadly game where the stakes were human lives. He was never caught. He was never identified. He is known to the world only by the name he chose for himself, the Zodiac. Before you get comfortable, maybe think for a moment about the last time a news story truly unsettled you. Think about how a stranger's words, through a headline or a quote, can enter your home and your mind, making the world feel a little less safe, a little more unpredictable. It's a comfort to know we can explore these dark chapters together. A quiet community gathering from all corners of the globe. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. And on that note, if you truly appreciate what we do here, the quiet, respectful space we try to create for these stories, a like and a subscribe is the very best way to show it. It helps us continue this journey together. Now, dim the lights. Let's travel back to the late 1960s, to the fog-shrouded hills of the San Francisco Bay Area, and the beginning of a reign of terror that has never truly ended. The Zodiac Killer, the San Francisco Bay Area in the late 1960s, was the epicenter of a cultural earthquake. It was the era of the summer of love, of Haight-Ashbury, of psychedelic music and a powerful, optimistic counterculture that preached peace and love. But beneath this vibrant, flower power facade, a darker current was beginning to flow. The optimism of the era was beginning to curdle into something more cynical, more violent. The Manson family murders in Southern California in 1969 would be the symbolic death of the peace and love dream. But in Northern California, another kind of terror, one that was more anonymous, more intellectual, and in some ways more terrifying, had already begun its work. The story of the killer who would call himself the Zodiac begins on a cold, dark night on the edge of the city of Vallejo, December 20th, 1968. It was a Friday night, just 5 days before Christmas. Two local high school students, 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen, were out on their very first date. Like countless teenagers before them, they had driven out to a secluded spot on Lake Herman Road, a lonely, unlit stretch of pavement known as a local lover's lane. It was a place for a moment of privacy, a quiet end to a first date. At approximately 11:15 p.m., another car pulled up beside them. A man got out armed with a .22 caliber pistol. What happened next was an act of cold, efficient brutality. The man ordered the two teenagers out of their car. David Faraday was shot once in the head as he was exiting the vehicle. Betty Lou Jensen, in a desperate bid for her life, tried to run. She didn't get far. The killer shot her 5 times in the back. The two teenagers were left to die in the gravel turnout on the side of the dark road. The crime was shocking in its senselessness. There was no robbery, no apparent sexual assault, no clear motive at all. The Vallejo Police Department investigated, but they had very little to go on. It was a tragic but seemingly random double homicide. For the next 6 months, the case went cold. The killer, whoever he was, had melted back into the night, leaving behind only 2 dead teenagers and a handful of shell casings. Then, on the night of July 4th, 1969, the phantom struck again. Another young couple, 22-year-old Darlene Farron and 19-year-old Michael Mageau, were parked in another one of Vallejo's lovers' lanes, this time at the Blue Rock Springs Park, just a few miles from the first murder scene. Darlene was a popular local waitress, and Michael was a friend. As they sat in the car, another vehicle pulled up behind them, its headlights shining in their rearview mirror. The car then drove away, only to return a few minutes later, parking alongside them. A man got out of the car, holding a powerful flashlight that he shone directly into their eyes, blinding them. He was also holding a 9mm pistol. Without saying a word, he opened fire, pumping multiple shots into the car. Both Darlene and Michael were hit repeatedly. Michael was struck in the face, neck, and chest. Darlene was hit multiple times and would die from her injuries. The killer then calmly walked back to his car and drove away. But this time there was a survivor. Michael Mageau, despite his horrific injuries, was alive. And this time the killer did not remain silent. At 12:40 a.m. on July 5th, just 40 minutes after the shooting, the phone rang at the Vallejo Police Department. The dispatcher, Nancy Slover, answered. On the other end of the line was a man's voice. It was low, calm, and monotone. A chillingly robotic voice that seemed to be reading from a script. "I wish to report a murder," the man said. "No, a double murder. They are 2 miles north of the park headquarters. They were in a brown car. I used a 9mm Luger." Then, in a final chilling statement, he took credit for the crime that had baffled the police for 6 months. "I also killed those kids last year," he said. "Goodbye." The police now knew they were dealing with a serial killer, a predator who was specifically targeting young couples in secluded areas. But the killer was not content to simply communicate with the police. He wanted a public audience. On July 31st, 1969, 3 nearly identical letters arrived at the offices of the 3 major Bay Area newspapers: the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. The letters were written in a strange, almost childlike, blocky handwriting. In them, the writer claimed responsibility for the 2 attacks, providing details that only the killer could have known. He was taunting the police, reveling in his crimes. But the letters contained something else, something that would turn the case into a national obsession. Each letter included 1/3 of a 408-symbol cryptogram. The killer demanded that the newspapers publish his cipher on their front pages. If they failed to do so, he threatened to go on a killing rampage that weekend and cruise around all weekend killing lone people in the night, then move on to kill again, until I end up with a dozen people over the weekend. At the end of his letters, he signed off with a strange, new symbol, a circle with a cross through it, like the crosshairs of a rifle scope. The killer had given himself a signature. The newspapers, after a frantic debate with law enforcement, decided to comply with the killer's demand. On August 2nd, the cipher was published. The public was now officially part of the killer's game. The FBI's cryptoanalysis unit was stumped by the complex cipher. But just a few days later, a high school teacher from Salinas, California, named Donald Hardin, along with his wife Betty, managed to do what the experts could not. They cracked the code. The message they uncovered was a terrifying glimpse into the mind of the killer. It was a rambling, grammatically poor, and deeply disturbing manifesto. It read, in part, "I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is that when I die I will be reborn in paradise, and they have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife." The message was chilling. It revealed a killer who was not driven by anger or lust, but by a twisted, pseudo-religious belief system. He was killing not just for sport, but to collect souls for his own personal paradise. On August 7th, another letter arrived at the San Francisco Examiner. It began with a new, taunting greeting: "Dear editor, this is the Zodiac speaking." The Phantom had finally given himself a name. The Zodiac killer had been born, and his deadly game with the police, the press, and the public was only just beginning. With the cracking of the first cipher, the Zodiac killer had successfully transformed himself from an anonymous murderer into a media sensation and a public bogeyman. He had established his persona: a cunning, intelligent, and taunting killer who was always one step ahead of the police. He reveled in the fear and attention he was generating, and he was not about to let the spotlight fade. He would strike again, but this time he would change his method, his location, and his costume, creating a crime so bizarre and theatrical it seemed designed for maximum psychological terror. The scene shifted from the urban outskirts of Vallejo to the serene, sun-drenched shores of Lake Berryessa in Napa County. On the afternoon of Saturday, September 27, 1969, 2 young college students, 20-year-old Brian Hartnell and 22-year-old Cecilia Shepard, were enjoying a quiet picnic on a secluded peninsula. It was a peaceful, idyllic setting. As they were relaxing on their blanket, a man emerged from behind a nearby tree. His appearance was utterly terrifying. He was wearing a strange, executioner-style black hood that covered his entire head and face, with dark sunglasses clipped onto the front over the eye holes. On his chest, he wore a white bib-like garment emblazoned with the now infamous cross-circle symbol. He was holding a pistol. The hooded man approached the terrified couple. He spoke in the same calm, monotone voice that had been heard on the 911 call. He told them he was an escaped convict from a prison in Montana and that he needed their car and their money to get to Mexico. He ordered Cecilia to tie up Brian with a length of plastic clothesline he provided. He then tied up Cecilia himself. Brian, trying to keep the situation calm, engaged the man in conversation, asking about his life. The hooded figure was surprisingly forthcoming, talking about his escape and his plans. For a moment, it seemed as if this might just be a robbery. But then the man's demeanor changed. He put away his pistol and, to the couple's horror, pulled out a long, double-edged knife. "I'm going to have to stab you people," he said, his voice as flat and emotionless as ever. He then proceeded to brutally and methodically stab both Brian and Cecilia. He stabbed Brian 6 times in the back and Cecilia 10 times in the back and abdomen. The attack was savage and relentless. After he had finished, the man calmly walked away. Before he left, he walked over to Brian's car and, using a black felt-tip pen, drew his cross-circle symbol on the car door. Beneath it, he wrote the dates of his previous attacks and the date of the current one, publicly taking credit for his work. He then left the scene. Miraculously, both victims were still alive. A fisherman heard their cries for help and alerted the park rangers. They were rushed to the hospital. Cecilia Shepard, sadly, would succumb to her injuries 2 days later. But Brian Hartnell, despite his severe wounds, survived. He was able to provide the police with a detailed, first-hand account of the attack and a description of the killer's bizarre costume and strange, calm demeanor. The Zodiac had once again left behind a survivor and a new set of terrifying clues. An hour after the attack at Lake Berryessa, a call came into the Napa County Sheriff's Office. The dispatcher answered, and it was him again, the same slow, monotone voice. "I want to report a murder, no, a double murder," he said, echoing his previous call. "They are 2 miles north of park headquarters. I'm the one that did it." He then hung up. The police traced the call to a payphone outside a car wash in Napa. By the time they arrived, he was long gone. The Zodiac was now escalating his campaign of terror, becoming more brazen, more theatrical, and his next and final confirmed murder would be his most audacious yet. He was moving from the secluded lovers' lanes and parks into the heart of a major city. On the night of Saturday, October 11th, 1969, just 2 weeks after the Lake Berryessa attack, the Zodiac hailed a cab in downtown San Francisco. The driver was a 29-year-old man named Paul Stein. Stein picked up the passenger and was directed to drive to the upscale residential neighborhood of Presidio Heights. As they reached the corner of Washington and Cherry Streets, the passenger produced a 9mm pistol and shot Paul Stein once in the back of the head, killing him instantly. The killer then took Stein's wallet and car keys. But he did not immediately flee. He lingered at the scene. He tore off a large piece of Paul Stein's blood-soaked shirt. This brazen act was witnessed by a group of teenagers across the street, who saw the man in the front of the cab, appearing to wipe it down. Believing they were witnessing a robbery, they called the police. The initial police dispatch that went out over the radio made a critical and now famous error. The dispatcher, based on the teenager's initial description, reported that the suspect was a black male. When the first 2 police officers arrived on the scene, just minutes later, they saw a white male walking calmly away from the intersection, just a block from the crime scene. Because he did not match the broadcast description, they simply drove past him, stopping only to ask if he had seen anything unusual. The man pointed them further down the street, and they drove on. It is now widely believed that the man they stopped and spoke to was the Zodiac killer himself. He had walked right past them, a ghost in the San Francisco fog. A few days later, on October 14th, another letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle. The envelope contained the proof that this was the work of the Zodiac. A small, bloody piece of Paul Stein's shirt. The letter itself was filled with the Zodiac's usual taunts and braggadocio. He described the murder in detail and mocked the police for their incompetence. He wrote, "The SF police could have caught me last night if they had searched the park properly instead of holding road races with their motorcycles, seeing who could make the most noise." He then ended the letter with a new, terrifying threat. He claimed he was now going to target children. "School children make nice targets," he wrote. "I think I shall wipe out a school bus some morning." This threat sent a new wave of panic across the Bay Area. Police escorts began to follow school buses. Parents kept their children home from school. The Zodiac had successfully escalated his campaign from a series of isolated murders to a citywide psychological terror. He was no longer just a killer. He was a public menace, a villain who seemed to be able to strike anywhere, at any time, and who was now threatening the most vulnerable members of society. The manhunt intensified, but the Zodiac remained as elusive as ever. A phantom who communicated only through his letters, his ciphers, and his trail of dead. The murder of Paul Stein marked the last time the Zodiac killer would be definitively linked to a homicide. After the Stein murder and the subsequent threat against a school bus, his reign of terror shifted almost entirely from physical violence to a sustained campaign of psychological warfare waged through the mail. He seemed to revel in the fear and media attention he had generated, and he continued to send a steady stream of taunting letters and complex ciphers to the press and police for several years. These communications became the primary focus of the investigation, a one-sided conversation with a ghost. On November 8, 1969, he sent what is perhaps his most famous and most complex piece of correspondence, a new 340-character cipher. The letter accompanying it was filled with his usual boasts. "This is the Zodiac speaking." It began, "I have killed 7 people. I shall no longer announce to you when I commit my murders. They shall look like routine robberies, killings of anger, and a few fake accidents, etc." This new cipher, known as the Z340, was far more complex than the first. It used a greater variety of symbols and a more sophisticated encryption method. The FBI's top cryptographers, along with amateur code breakers around the world, worked on it for decades, but it remained stubbornly, maddeningly unsolved. It became one of the holy grails of cryptography, a silent, symbolic testament to the killer's intelligence and his ability to remain one step ahead of those who pursued him. Throughout 1970 and 1971, the letters continued to arrive. They were filled with threats, astrological references, and bizarre, rambling accounts of his philosophy. He claimed responsibility for numerous other crimes, though none of these could ever be confirmed. He mocked the police, giving them sarcastic advice on how to catch him. He created a scoreboard, keeping a running tally of his supposed victims, a number that grew with each new letter. He was building his own legend, meticulously crafting the persona of an all-powerful, omniscient killer. The investigation, meanwhile, was mired in frustration. The police had a massive amount of evidence: letters, ciphers, ballistics reports, and witness descriptions, but no clear path to a suspect. The witness descriptions themselves were a source of confusion. The survivors of the Blue Rock Springs and Lake Berryessa attacks, and the teenagers who saw the killer after the Stein murder, all gave slightly different descriptions. The man was described as being heavyset, stocky, or of medium build. His hair was described as brown or reddish-brown. The only consistent details were that he was a white male, likely in his late 20s to early 40s, and wore glasses. The composite sketches that were produced were generic, a face that could belong to 1,000 different men in the Bay Area. The police investigated thousands of potential suspects over the years. The most prominent, and the one who remains the favorite of many investigators and online sleuths, was a man named Arthur Lee Allen. Allen was a former elementary school teacher who had been fired for inappropriate conduct with students. He was a deeply disturbed and intelligent man with a history of strange behavior and a fascination with weapons and codes. The circumstantial evidence against him was incredibly compelling. He lived in Vallejo near the scenes of the first two attacks. He owned the same brand of typewriter that was used to type one of the Zodiac letters. He wore a Zodiac brand wristwatch with the cross-circle symbol on its face. He owned boots of the same size and brand as the footprints found at the Lake Berryessa crime scene. And on the day of the Lake Berryessa attack, he had told his family he was going scuba diving there. But he returned home late, his car filled with bloody knives. Allen was interviewed by police multiple times, and his home was searched. He denied any involvement and passed a polygraph test, though the reliability of these tests is highly debatable. In 2002, years after Allen's death, a DNA comparison was made between a saliva sample from the envelopes of the Zodiac letters and a DNA sample from one of Allen's friends, to whom Allen had sent letters. The results were not a match. A fingerprint found at the Stein crime scene also did not match Allen. For many, this cleared him definitively, but for others, the circumstantial case remains too powerful to ignore. They argue that the DNA on the envelopes could have come from someone else who licked the stamps, and that the fingerprint may not have belonged to the killer. Arthur Lee Allen went to his grave in 1992, a free man, but he remains the central, haunting figure in the Zodiac case. A man who fit the profile so perfectly that his apparent innocence is almost as baffling as the crimes themselves. Other suspects have emerged over the years. Richard Marshall, a silent film enthusiast who lived in the Bay Area, was another person of interest. He had a similar appearance and owned a teletype machine, which some believed was used to create the ciphers. Another was a man named Lawrence Kane, who had worked in the same hotel as one of the Zodiac's possible victims and had been diagnosed as having lost the ability to control his impulses. But like Allen, the evidence against these men was purely circumstantial. The Zodiac's communications became more sporadic after 1971, and the last letter that is definitively attributed to him was sent in 1974. In it, he gave a final, chilling review of the film The Exorcist, calling it the best satirical comedy that I have ever seen. After that, the Zodiac, the public persona, fell silent. The question of why he stopped is one of the most enduring mysteries of the case. Did he die? Was he imprisoned for another crime? Or did he simply grow bored of his game and decide to retire, content with the legend he had created? The abrupt end to his reign of terror is as inexplicable as its beginning. He had held an entire region hostage, taunted the most powerful law enforcement agencies in the country, and had created a myth that would outlive him. And then, he simply vanished, a ghost returning to the fog. The case was left in a state of permanent suspension, a collection of terrifying, unsolved crimes and a series of cryptic puzzles that seemed to hold the key to a truth that was always just out of reach. In the decades following the Zodiac's final confirmed letter in 1974, the case entered a long, cold winter, but it never truly died. It became a permanent and obsessive fixture in the world of true crime, a puzzle that has been passed down through generations of detectives, journalists, and amateur sleuths. The files remained open, the evidence periodically re-examined, and the hope for a breakthrough, however faint, never completely extinguished. The Zodiac's legend was sustained by his most ingenious and frustrating creation, his ciphers. For over 51 years, the complex 340-character cipher remained unsolved, a testament to the killer's cunning. It was a source of endless fascination and frustration for cryptographers, both professional and amateur. It became a kind of Mount Everest for codebreakers, a challenge that many attempted but none could conquer. The FBI, the NSA, and countless others had tried and failed. It was believed that the key to the killer's identity might be hidden within its strange symbols. Then, in December of 2020, the impossible happened. A team of 3 amateur codebreakers from 3 different countries, David Orenchak, a web designer from Virginia, Sam Blake, an applied mathematician from Australia, and Jarl van Eyck, a warehouse operator and computer programmer from Belgium, finally cracked the code. They had spent years working on the cipher, using a combination of human intuition and sophisticated code-breaking software. The solution they found was both a monumental breakthrough and a profound disappointment. The decoded message read, "I hope you are having lots of fun in trying to catch me. That wasn't me on the TV show, which brings up a point about me. I am not afraid of the gas chamber because it will send me to paradise all the sooner because I now have enough slaves to work for me where everyone else has nothing when they reach paradise, so they are afraid of death. I am not afraid because I know that my new life will be an easy one in paradise death. The message was pure, unfiltered Zodiac. It was filled with his characteristic misspellings, paradise, his taunts, and his grandiose, self-serving mythology of collecting slaves for the afterlife, but it contained no clues to his identity. The great secret that had been locked away for half a century was simply more of the same. More boasting, more psychological games. The cracking of the Z340 was a historic moment in the history of the case. A brilliant achievement of collaborative, citizen-led investigation. But it was also a final, posthumous taunt from the killer himself. The great puzzle, when finally solved, revealed only the same empty, narcissistic void that had been there all along. The legacy of the Zodiac killer is profound and multifaceted. He was a pioneer of a new kind of crime, murder as a form of media-savvy terrorism. He understood, perhaps better than any killer before him, the power of the media to amplify fear and to create a legend. He was not content to simply kill. He needed to be the author of his own story, to control the narrative of his own terror. His letters and ciphers were not just clues. They were press releases, carefully crafted pieces of a public relations campaign for a serial murderer. He turned his crimes into a conversation, a one-sided dialogue with a terrified public, and in doing so, he wrote the playbook for many of the media-obsessed killers who would follow. His case also represents a landmark in the history of police investigation. It was one of the first major, multi-jurisdictional serial killer cases, forcing police departments that were used to working independently to try and collaborate. The frustrations and failures of the Zodiac investigation highlighted the need for better communication and data sharing between law enforcement agencies, a need that would eventually lead to the creation of centralized databases and profiling units like the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. But the most enduring legacy of the Zodiac is his anonymity. He remains a ghost, a question mark. The fact that he was never caught is the source of his enduring power. Unlike other infamous killers like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, whose capture and execution provided a sense of closure, the Zodiac case offers none. It is a story with no final chapter, a wound that has never healed. He is a permanent fixture in our collective consciousness because he represents the ultimate triumph of the monster, the terrifying idea that a person can commit the most heinous crimes, taunt the world, and then simply walk away, living out the rest of his life in quiet, anonymous freedom. Today, the investigation continues, driven largely by the passion of independent researchers and the slim hope that a new advance in forensic science might finally provide an answer. In recent years, genetic genealogy has been seen as the last, best hope. If a viable DNA sample can be extracted from the saliva on the old letter envelopes, it could be used to build a family tree and, potentially, to finally put a name to the phantom. But the evidence is old, degraded, and has been handled by countless people. The prospect of finding a clean, usable sample remains uncertain. The Zodiac killer is more than just a cold case. He is a piece of American folklore. He is the ultimate bogeyman, the faceless killer who came out of the fog, held a city in his grip, and then vanished, leaving behind only a name, a symbol, and a series of terrifying, unanswered questions. He is a permanent reminder that some puzzles are never solved, and some ghosts are never laid to rest. The Zodiac was a killer who used the media to craft a terrifying public persona. But some killers have no need for such theatrics. Their evil is quieter, more intimate, and their mysteries are not about a public game, but about a single, tragic act of violence that leaves behind a victim with no name and a community with no answers. The Freeway Phantom, Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1971 was a city holding its breath. It was a capital in turmoil, caught in the crosscurrents of the Vietnam War, civil rights struggles, and a deep, simmering social unrest. But away from the marbled halls of power, in the predominantly African-American neighborhoods east of the Anacostia River, life was defined by more immediate concerns. These were communities of working-class families, vibrant hubs of culture and church life, but they were also places often neglected by the city's official power structures, areas where the promise of the capital felt a world away. It was a world where children played freely in the streets, and where the greatest dangers were thought to be a part of the everyday urban landscape. But in the spring of that year, a new and terrifying kind of danger would emerge, a silent, methodical predator who would turn the familiar streets and highways into his own personal hunting ground. The nightmare began on the afternoon of Monday, April 25, 1971. A 13-year-old girl named Carol Spinks had just been given a simple chore by her older sister. She was to walk a few blocks from their home in Southeast DC to a local 7-Eleven to buy groceries for the family's dinner. Carol was a bright and responsible 7th grader, a girl on the very cusp of her teenage years. The errand was a routine part of her life, a walk she had made countless times before. She left her home around 4:30 p.m. She was never seen alive again. When she failed to return, her family's initial annoyance quickly curdled into a cold, gnawing fear. They knew Carol. She was not a runaway. She was not a troublemaker. They called the police and a frantic search began. Friends, family, and neighbors fanned out, combing the familiar streets, their calls echoing into the darkening spring evening. For 6 agonizing days, there was no word, no sign, no clue as to what had happened to her. The city, it seemed, had simply swallowed her whole. Then, on the morning of Saturday, May 1st, the search came to a horrifying end. A highway maintenance crew was cleaning a grassy, sloping embankment alongside the I-295, a major federal highway that cuts through the southern part of the district. There, hidden in the tall grass just a few feet from the ceaseless rush of commuter traffic, they found her. It was the body of Carol Spinks. An autopsy would later reveal that she had been brutally assaulted and then strangled. The discovery sent a wave of shock and grief through her community. But to the wider city and its police force, it was, at first, treated as a tragic but sadly not uncommon act of violent crime. For 2 months, the case went cold. The city moved on, and the murder of a young girl from a poor neighborhood failed to capture the sustained attention of the press or the public. Then, on July 8th, the phantom struck again. This time, the victim was even younger. Darlenia Johnson was a bright, happy 11-year-old girl. On that summer afternoon, she was at a local playground near her home, a place where she had spent countless happy hours. She was last seen by a playground supervisor at around 4 p.m. When she didn't come home for dinner, her family began the same terrible ritual of frantic searching and desperate phone calls that the Spinks family had endured. The search for Darlenia was agonizingly short. 11 days later, on July 19th, her body was found. The location was chillingly, terrifyingly familiar. She was discovered on the same grassy embankment of the I-295, just a few yards from where Carol Spinks's body had been found. The cause of death was the same: strangulation. Now, the police and the city could no longer dismiss the killings as isolated incidents. A pattern had emerged, a signature so clear and so cold it was undeniable. A serial killer was at work in the nation's capital, a predator who was targeting young, African-American girls. He would abduct them from their own neighborhoods, hold them for a period of days, and then discard their bodies along the same stretch of highway, a place of constant motion and transient anonymity. The press, which had paid little attention to the first murder, now seized upon the story. They gave the faceless killer a name, a moniker that captured the geography of his crimes: the Freeway Phantom. The name stuck, and it spread a new kind of terror through the city. The Phantom was not a monster who lurked in a single, dark corner. He was mobile. The freeways, the arteries that connected the city, were now seen as his domain, his personal dumping ground. The Washington, D.C. police force, now under intense public pressure, assembled a large task force. But they were faced with an almost impossible challenge. The victims seemed to be chosen at random. The abductions occurred in broad daylight, yet there were no credible witnesses. The killer left behind no fingerprints, no fibers, no clues other than the bodies of his victims. He was a ghost, a predator who could move through the city's most vulnerable neighborhoods, select a victim, and then vanish without a trace. As the summer of 1971 wore on, a palpable fear gripped the African-American communities of D.C. Parents were terrified to let their children out of their sight. The simple childhood freedom of walking to the store or playing in a local park was gone, replaced by a constant, nagging fear. The police were everywhere, questioning, searching, but they were no closer to an answer. The city waited, hoping and praying that the two murders were the end of the story. But the freeway phantom was just getting started. He had established his pattern, and as the summer turned to fall, he would continue his reign of terror, becoming more brazen, more confident, and even beginning to communicate, taunting the very community he was terrorizing. The long, hot summer of fear was about to get much, much colder. The city of Washington, D.C. lived in a state of suspended terror throughout the late summer and early fall of 1971. The freeway phantom, having claimed 2 young victims, had gone silent, but his presence was a constant, unspoken fear in the city's eastern neighborhoods. Every parent who saw their child off to school, every girl who walked home from a friend's house, did so with a new and terrifying awareness of the shadow that now hung over their community. The police task force worked tirelessly, following up on hundreds of tips, but the phantom remained elusive. Then, in October, he re-emerged, and his reign of terror entered a new, more horrifying phase. On the afternoon of October 1st, 1971, 10-year-old Brenda Faye Crockett failed to return home from her elementary school. She had been sent on an errand to a local grocery store by her mother after school, a simple task she had performed many times. When she didn't come back, her family immediately feared the worst. The pattern was all too familiar. This time, however, there was a new and deeply disturbing element. That evening, the Crockett family's telephone rang. On the other end of the line was the small, terrified voice of a child. It was Brenda. She was crying. She told her mother that a white man had picked her up in a car. The line was full of static, and Brenda's voice was faint, as if she were speaking from a great distance. She was only on the phone for a few moments before the line went dead. Over the next hour, 2 more of these strange, brief phone calls came in. In one, Brenda could be heard crying for her daddy. In another, she simply said, "Ma," before the line was cut. It was a form of psychological torture, a killer allowing his victim to make a final, desperate contact with her family, a way of announcing that he had her, that she was alive, but that she was completely under his control. The next morning, the search for Brenda Crockett came to a tragic end. Her body was found in a wooded area just off U.S. Route 50, a major highway near the Baltimore-Washington Parkway. The location was different from the I-295 embankment, but the method was the same. She had been assaulted and strangled. The freeway phantom had claimed his 3rd victim. The phone calls were a chilling escalation. They suggested a killer who was not just a predator, but a performer, a sadist who derived pleasure from the psychological torment of his victims' families. He was now engaging with them directly, making his presence known. Just 12 days later, on October 12th, another young girl vanished. Nenomoshia Yates, a 12-year-old, disappeared while walking home from a Safeway grocery store in her northeast D.C. neighborhood. The pattern was now grimly, terrifyingly predictable. The community waited in dread. 1 hour after she was last seen, a chilling phone call was made to her home. It was Nenomoshia. She was crying and told her mother she was in a white house with a white man. Then the line went dead. Her body was found 2 days later, dumped on the side of a road in Prince George's County, Maryland. She had been strangled. The phantom was now operating with a terrifying speed and confidence. He was no longer waiting months between his attacks. He was a hunter in the midst of a frenzy. The police were desperate. They had no physical evidence, and the only description of the killer was the one provided by the young, terrified victims over the phone. A white man. This description, however, would later be questioned, with some investigators believing the children may have been coerced or confused. The climax of the phantom's reign of terror would come in November. On the evening of November 18, 1971, 2 girls, 18-year-old Brenda Woodard and 16-year-old Diane Williams, were having dinner together at a local hot dog stand. They left together, planning to go to a movie. They never made it. Both girls vanished. The next morning, the body of Brenda Woodard was found in a wooded area in Prince George's County. She had been stabbed multiple times and strangled. But Diane Williams was not with her. For the first time, one of the Phantom's victims seemed to have escaped, or was still being held captive. The police now had a new and desperate hope. Perhaps Diane was still alive. They launched a massive public appeal for her safe return. But it was during this period of intense investigation that the Freeway Phantom made his most direct and most chilling communication yet. He had taken a piece of paper from one of Brenda Woodard's school notebooks. On it, in crude, blocky handwriting, he wrote a taunting, terrifying note. He then forced his captive, Diane Williams, to read the note aloud over the phone to the police. The note read, "This is to let you know that I am the one who is responsible for all the murders in this city. I have no hang-ups about killing. The girls who I have killed are all black. I will admit to the one in Maryland also. I am a black man. I will kill again. I have no reason for killing. It is just a pleasure. I have no intention of surrendering. Tell the pigs to kiss my ass." He then dictated a final, personal message for Diane's parents, forcing her to read it aloud. After she had finished, he told the police operator, "You can find the other girl's body over there by the PG hospital." Then he hung up. The police, following his directions, found the body of Diane Williams just a few hours later. She too had been strangled. The note was a bombshell that turned the entire investigation on its head. The killer was claiming to be a black man, directly contradicting the previous descriptions given by his victims. Was he telling the truth, or was this another piece of deliberate misdirection? An attempt to sow racial tension and send the police down a new false trail? The note's strange, almost formal tone and its taunting message to the pigs seemed designed to inflame and confuse. The Freeway Phantom had now killed 6 young women in the space of just 7 months. He had terrorized a city, taunted the police, and had done it all without leaving behind a single piece of credible evidence that could lead to his identity. He was a ghost who had given himself a voice, and that voice was one of pure, nihilistic evil. The city of Washington, D.C. was at his mercy, living in fear of a killer who seemed to be able to strike whenever and wherever he pleased. The police had a taunting letter and a disembodied voice on a tape, but they were no closer to knowing the true face of the Phantom. The taunting note dictated by the killer and read by his final victim, Diane Williams, was a pivotal and deeply confusing moment in the investigation. The Phantom's declaration that he was a black man directly contradicted the statements made by 2 of his other victims, Brenda Crockett and Nenomoshia Yates, who had both claimed in their terrified phone calls that their abductor was a white man. This contradiction created a deep schism in the investigation. Was the killer a white man trying to frame the black community, or a black man trying to throw the police off his trail with false descriptions? The note, intended as a boast, had succeeded only in deepening the mystery and sowing more confusion. Despite this confusion, the investigation began to coalesce around a single powerful theory, one that focused not on a lone wolf killer, but on a small, organized group of predators. This theory was born from a separate, ongoing investigation into a series of abductions and assaults that had been occurring in the same neighborhoods. The police had identified a group of men who were suspected of being involved in a kidnap prostitution ring, a group that would abduct young women and force them into sexual servitude. The lead investigators on the Phantom case, particularly those in the homicide division, began to see a strong and terrifying overlap between the activities of this group and the Freeway Phantom murders. The theory was that the Phantom was not a single person, but a collective name for this group of men. They would abduct the girls, hold them captive, and then, when a girl became too defiant, too difficult to control, or had perhaps seen too much, she would be murdered and her body disposed of. This would explain the time lag between the abduction and the discovery of the bodies, a period of days or even weeks. It would also explain the contradictory descriptions of the killer. Perhaps some of the men in the group were white and some were black. The victim's description would simply depend on which member of the group she was with when she made the call. The investigation into this group of suspects became the central focus of the Freeway Phantom Task Force. The police identified a number of key individuals, men who were known to associate with each other and had a history of violent crime. They were placed under intense surveillance. The police were building a complex, circumstantial case, hoping to connect one or more of these men directly to the Phantom murders. One of the most promising pieces of evidence was the handwriting on the note found in Brenda Woodard's notebook. Forensic handwriting experts analyzed the crude, blocky script and compared it to samples from their list of suspects. They found a potential match to one of the men in the suspected ring. But a potential match in handwriting analysis is not the same as a fingerprint. It was a strong lead, but it was not definitive proof. As the police closed in on this group, a strange and abrupt silence fell over the city. After the murder of Diane Williams in November of 1971, the killings stopped. The taunting notes and phone calls ceased. The freeway phantom, who had been operating with such terrifying frequency and confidence, simply vanished. This sudden cessation of the crimes has been interpreted in several ways. The most optimistic view is that the intense police pressure on the suspected group had worked. The killers, knowing that law enforcement was onto them, simply stopped their activities to avoid capture. They disbanded, went to ground, and the reign of terror ended. In this version of events, the police, while never securing a conviction for the murders, had successfully stopped the killing. Another, more cynical theory is that the killer or killers were eventually arrested and imprisoned for other, unrelated crimes. The criminal justice system of the 1970s was a different world, and it's entirely possible that one or more of the prime suspects were sent to prison for robbery, assault, or other offenses, and the connection to the Phantom case was never officially made. They may have lived out their lives and even died in prison, taking the secret of the freeway phantom with them. And then there is the more disturbing possibility that the killer or killers simply decided to stop. Serial offenders sometimes do, for reasons that are often known only to them. They may have moved away from the area, they may have found a different outlet for their compulsions, or they may have simply been satisfied with the terror they had created. In this scenario, the Phantom was never caught because he simply chose to disappear, melting back into the society he had terrorized, perhaps living a quiet, normal life, a monster hidden in plain sight. The case of the freeway phantom officially went cold. The task force was eventually disbanded. The massive files, filled with thousands of pages of interviews, reports, and dead-end leads, were boxed up and sent to the archives. For the city of Washington, D.C., and particularly for its African-American community, the lack of a resolution was a deep and painful wound. The families of the 6 victims, Carol Spinks, Darlenia Johnson, Brenda Crockett, Nenomoshia Yates, Brenda Woodard, and Diane Williams, were left without justice. Their daughter's killer a nameless, faceless specter. The case became a dark piece of DC folklore, a ghost story that parents would tell their children to warn them of the dangers of talking to strangers. It was a story of a specific time and place, a reflection of the racial and social tensions of the early 1970s, and a testament to the vulnerability of communities that are often overlooked and underprotected by the systems of power. But the story was not entirely over. The physical evidence from the crime scenes, including the note and biological samples, was carefully preserved. And as the years turned into decades, a revolution in forensic science was on the horizon. The development of DNA technology would offer a new, powerful tool, a way to potentially reach back in time and put a definitive name to the ghost who had haunted the city for so long. The hope was that a single hair, a microscopic trace of skin or saliva left behind by the killer, could finally do what thousands of hours of traditional police work could not: give the freeway phantom a true face, and give his victims' families the justice they had been denied for a generation. The silent evidence, stored away in a cold evidence locker, was waiting for the science to catch up with it. For more than 3 decades, the freeway phantom case lay dormant, a cold, frustrating file in the archives of the DC Metropolitan Police. The primary suspects from the early 1970s had aged, died, or disappeared, and the trail had grown impossibly cold. But the advent of DNA technology in the 21st century offered a new and powerful hope. In the mid-2000s, driven by advances in forensic science and a renewed interest in solving the nation's most notorious cold cases, investigators decided to re-examine the physical evidence from the Phantom murders. The hope was that the killer had, in his arrogance, made a mistake. Perhaps he had left behind a microscopic trace of himself on his victims' clothing, on the ropes he used to bind them, or on the taunting note he had forced Diane Williams to read. The evidence was sent to the FBI's crime lab in Quantico, Virginia, for a state-of-the-art analysis. The community and the victims' families waited with a renewed, anxious anticipation. A definitive DNA match would be the smoking gun that had eluded investigators for a generation. A final, scientific answer to a mystery that had been built on whispers and shadows. In 2009, the results of the DNA testing came back. The outcome was a profound and crushing disappointment. The forensic scientists had been unable to extract a viable, complete DNA profile of an unknown male from any of the evidence. The passage of time, the degradation of the samples, and the limitations of the original evidence collection methods had rendered the most powerful tool in modern forensics useless. The ghost had once again slipped through their fingers. The last, best hope for a definitive scientific resolution to the case had been extinguished. Despite this setback, the case has not been entirely forgotten. It remains officially open, and cold case detectives continue to periodically review the files. The primary theory among many retired and current investigators still centers on the original group of suspects from the early 1970s. The belief remains that the phantom was not a single individual, but a small, organized group, and that the sudden end to the killings was a direct result of the intense police pressure and surveillance that was brought to bear on them. In this view, the case is not unsolved in the sense that the police had no idea who was responsible. It is unsolved because they were never able to build a prosecutable, beyond a reasonable doubt case against the men they were certain had committed the crimes. The legacy of the Freeway Phantom is a dark and complex one. He was one of a series of high-profile, faceless serial killers, like the Zodiac, who terrorized American cities in the late 1960s and early 1970s. These killers represented a new kind of modern horror. They were not driven by traditional motives like money or passion. They killed randomly, they taunted the police, and they seemed to revel in the public fear they created. They were monsters who emerged from the anonymity of modern urban life, and the Freeway Phantom was Washington, D.C.'s own private bogeyman. The case also holds a painful and significant place in the city's social and racial history. The victims were all young, black girls from working-class neighborhoods. Many in the community felt at the time, and still feel today, that the initial police response was not as swift or as robust as it would have been if the victims had been white or from a wealthier part of the city. The case became a symbol of the deep-seated inequalities that existed in the nation's capital, a tragic illustration of how some lives were valued more than others. The Phantom preyed upon a community that was already marginalized, exploiting a vulnerability that was not just personal, but systemic. For the families of the 6 victims, the legacy is one of unending grief and a profound lack of closure. The killer of their daughters was never publicly named, never held accountable for his actions. Their loss is compounded by the fact that the case has largely faded from the national consciousness, overshadowed by other, more famous serial killer cases. They have been left to carry the burden of their memory alone. Their quest for justice, a quiet, decades-long vigil. Today, the case of the Freeway Phantom remains one of Washington, D.C.'s most haunting and unsolved mysteries. The identity of the killer or killers is a secret that is likely lost forever to death and the passage of time. Was he the white man his victims described in their final, terrified moments? Or was he the black man he claimed to be in his final, taunting message? Or was he both a collective entity, a group of predators who shared a dark and terrible secret? We will likely never know. The Freeway Phantom is a ghost who haunts the highways and the history of a city. He is a testament to the fact that some killers get away with it, their identities forever shielded by a combination of cunning, luck, and a flawed investigation. He is a faceless symbol of a time of terror, a story that ends not with a resolution, but with a series of silent, unanswered questions, and the 6 young lives that were stolen by a shadow who came from nowhere and returned to the same, leaving behind only heartbreak and a chilling, enduring mystery. The Freeway Phantom was a monster who terrorized a city from the shadows, his identity a source of endless debate. But some monsters are not anonymous at all. They are figures of immense power and fame, and their downfall is not a mystery to be solved, but a public spectacle that brings a dark era to a definitive, and often violent, end. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. There is a place that is not just a museum, but a work of art in itself. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum is a Venetian palace in the heart of New England, a deeply personal and idiosyncratic creation of a woman who was as brilliant as she was eccentric. Isabella Stewart Gardner, a wealthy art collector and socialite of the Gilded Age, spent decades amassing a breathtaking collection of over 7,500 objects, paintings, sculptures, tapestries, and rare books from across the globe. She then designed and built a museum to house them, a 4-story Italianate villa surrounding a stunning, light-filled courtyard. It was her gift to the city, but it came with a series of strange and unbreakable rules. In her will, she stipulated that the collection must be permanently maintained for the education and enjoyment of the public forever, and that if any major work of art was ever moved from its specific, curated location, the entire collection was to be sold off at auction, and the museum closed for good. For nearly a century, her will was honored. The museum was a time capsule, a perfectly preserved monument to one woman's vision, its treasures hanging exactly where she had placed them. But in the early morning hours of Sunday, March 18, 1990, that sacred trust would be violated in the most spectacular and audacious art heist in modern history. The night before, the city of Boston had been a sea of green, a city in the throes of its annual St. Patrick's Day celebration. The streets were filled with revelers, the bars were overflowing, and the city's police force was stretched thin, their attention focused on managing the festive chaos. It was the perfect night for a crime that required a cover of noise and distraction. On duty at the Gardner Museum that night were 2 young security guards, 23-year-old Rick Abath and 25-year-old Randy Heston. They were an unlikely pair to be guarding a collection worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Abath was a long-haired, aspiring rock musician, a member of a local band called the Wrecking Crew. He was known for being a bit of a slacker and had a reputation for sometimes showing up to his shift. Under the influence, Heston was a more responsible figure, a student working his way through school. The security at the Gardner was notoriously lax, a relic of a more trusting era. The guards were undertrained, underpaid, and the museum's security system was primitive, little more than a series of motion detectors and a button that connected to the police station. The night began like any other. The guards made their rounds through the silent, dimly lit galleries, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty spaces. They were surrounded by masterpieces, works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, Manet, and Degas, ghosts of artistic genius that watched them from the walls. At approximately 1:24 a.m., a buzzer sounded at the museum's side entrance. 2 men, dressed in what appeared to be authentic Boston police uniforms, were standing at the door. They told Abath, who was on duty at the security desk, that they were responding to a report of a disturbance in the courtyard. Abath, looking at the 2 men on the security camera, saw the familiar uniforms and believed them completely. He broke a cardinal rule of museum security. He buzzed them in. The 2 men entered the lobby. One of them, the taller of the 2, had a thick, fake-looking mustache. He told Abath that he looked familiar and that there might be a warrant out for his arrest. He ordered Abath to step away from the security desk and face the wall. Abath, intimidated and believing he was dealing with real police officers, complied. In an instant, the 2 cops had him in handcuffs. When Randy Heston arrived on the scene a few moments later, he too was quickly subdued. The 2 guards, now bound and helpless, realized with a sickening certainty that these were not police officers. "You're not cops," one of them said. The thieves had taken control of the museum without firing a single shot, without a single act of overt violence. Their only weapons were a pair of convincing costumes and an air of authority. They led the 2 bound guards down to the museum's basement, a dark, labyrinthine space far from any potential witnesses. They wrapped duct tape around the guards' hands, feet, and heads, and then handcuffed them to a steam pipe and a workbench. "Don't tell anyone and you'll be fine," one of the thieves said. "You'll hear from us in about a year." With the guards secured, the 2 thieves now had the entire priceless collection of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum to themselves. They were completely alone with some of the greatest treasures of the Western world. and for the next 81 minutes, they moved through the silent galleries with a strange, almost leisurely purpose. This was not a quick smash and grab. This was a methodical, curated theft. They went directly to the museum's Dutch room, a gallery containing some of the most valuable pieces in the collection. They ignored many priceless works and went straight for their primary targets. They took Rembrandt's only known seascape, The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, and another of his masterpieces, A Lady and Gentleman in Black. They then went for the crown jewel of the entire museum, a painting so rare and so valuable it was considered by many to be the most important painting in any private collection in America. Johannes Vermeer's The Concert. There are only about 36 known Vermeer paintings in the world, and this was one of them. The thieves did not carefully remove the paintings from their frames. In an act of brutal, almost contemptuous, haste, they used a knife to crudely cut the canvases directly from their stretchers, a method that would horrify any art conservator. Their choices were baffling. In the same room, they ignored a priceless Titian and instead took a small, seemingly insignificant self-portrait etching by Rembrandt, about the size of a postage stamp. They went to another gallery and stole 5 drawings by the French master Edgar Degas and a painting by Edouard Manet. Their final and perhaps strangest thefts were not paintings at all. They smashed a display case and stole an ancient Chinese bronze beaker, or gu, from the Shang dynasty, and they pried a bronze eagle finial from the top of a Napoleonic flag. After 81 minutes of plunder, their work was done. They had stolen 13 priceless objects, with a combined estimated value of over $200 million, making it the single largest property theft in history. They took the videotapes from the security system's recorders, erasing any visual record of their presence. They then walked out of the museum and vanished into the early morning darkness of the city, leaving behind only 2 bound guards, a series of empty, gilded frames, and a mystery that would baffle the FBI and the art world for decades to come. The silent, sacred palace of Isabella Stewart Gardner had been violated, its heart torn out, and the hunt for the greatest lost treasures in the world had just begun. The morning of March 18, 1990, dawned on a scene of quiet devastation at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. The 2 bound security guards, Rick Abath and Randy Heston, remained handcuffed in the basement for hours after the thieves had departed. It wasn't until the morning shift of guards arrived at 8:15 a.m. and found the museum eerily silent that the alarm was finally raised. The police were called, and as they entered the museum, the full, shocking scope of the crime came into focus. The empty frames hanging on the walls of the Dutch room were like open wounds, a testament to a violation that was both a theft and a desecration. The greatest art heist in modern history had been successfully carried out, and the thieves had an 8-hour head start. The FBI immediately took the lead on the investigation, which was designated with the code name ArtNab. The initial focus was on the 2 guards themselves. Rick Abath, in particular, came under intense suspicion. His actions on the night of the heist were a series of baffling and catastrophic security breaches. Why had he buzzed the 2 men in direct violation of museum protocol? Why had he stepped away from the security desk and the panic button? Motion detector readouts from that night revealed another strange detail. For a brief period after the thieves had entered, Abath had opened and closed the side door again. Had he been signaling to someone outside? Investigators grilled him for hours, and he was the subject of intense scrutiny for years. But Abath maintained his innocence, claiming he was simply a young, undertrained guard who had been convincingly fooled by the police uniforms and had panicked. He passed multiple polygraph tests, and no direct evidence ever linked him to the crime. He was, in the end, seen not as a co-conspirator, but as the unwitting and incompetent pawn who had opened the castle gates. With the guards cleared of any official suspicion, the investigation turned to the thieves themselves. The problem was, they had left behind almost no physical evidence. They had taken the security tapes, wiping out any visual record of their faces or movements inside the museum. The crime scene was remarkably clean. The few fingerprints they left behind did not match anyone in the FBI's extensive databases. The only clues the investigators had were the accounts of the 2 guards and the bizarre, almost nonsensical selection of the stolen art. This selection became the central puzzle of the case. The thieves' choices were a baffling mix of the priceless and the seemingly trivial, the masterful and the mundane. They had taken 3 of the most valuable paintings in the collection, the 2 Rembrandts and the Vermeer, but they had left behind the museum's most valuable single piece, Titian's The Rape of Europa, which was hanging in a different gallery. They had stolen 5 Degas sketches but had left others. They had taken a small Rembrandt self-portrait etching but had left behind a much more valuable Rembrandt painting in the same room. And most strangely, they had stolen the ancient Chinese gu and the Napoleonic eagle finial, 2 objects that had significant historical value but a relatively low market value compared to the paintings. This strange shopping list led to a number of competing theories about the thieves' motives and identities. The first theory was that this was the work of a sophisticated, high-level art thief, a gentleman thief who was stealing on commission for a wealthy and scrupulous private collector. This would explain the targeting of specific famous works like the Vermeer. In this scenario, the collector, a Dr. No-type figure, had provided the thieves with a specific list of items he wanted for his private gallery. This theory, while popular in fiction, is often less common in reality. A stolen masterpiece of the fame of Vermeer's The Concert is essentially unsellable on any legitimate or even black market. It is too famous. Its only value would be to a collector who derived pleasure simply from possessing it in secret. The second theory was that the thieves were not art experts at all, but common, brutish criminals who were simply in over their heads. This would explain the crude way they had cut the canvases from their frames, an act that would make any true art lover cringe. It would also explain their seemingly random selection of items. Perhaps they had simply grabbed what looked valuable or what was easy to take. The Chinese gu and the eagle finial might have been taken simply because they looked like gold. In this version of events, the thieves were likely local Boston criminals who had gotten a tip about the Gardners' lax security and had pulled off a job that was far bigger and more successful than they had ever imagined. They would have quickly realized that their loot was too famous to sell and likely panicked, either destroying the art or hiding it away where it remains to this day. A third, more complex theory, and the one that the FBI has come to favor, is that the heist was carried out by a local organized crime crew with ties to the mafia. Boston in the 1990s had a thriving and violent criminal underworld, and the Gardner heist had all the hallmarks of a well-planned professional job. The use of police uniforms, the control of the scene, and the clean getaway all pointed to a level of sophistication beyond that of common burglars. In this scenario, the art was not stolen to be sold, but to be used as a bargaining chip. The priceless paintings were seen as the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card, a treasure that could be traded back to the authorities in exchange for leniency or a reduced sentence for a mob boss who was facing a long prison term. The FBI's investigation began to focus on the Boston-based mob, particularly the crew run by a notorious local crime figure named Carmelo Merlino. They spent years investigating Merlino and his associates, believing they were the key to the mystery. They uncovered a web of connections between the local mob, known art thieves, and even the security guard, Rick Abath, who was known to frequent the rock clubs and bars that Merlino's crew controlled. But they could never find the definitive link, the smoking gun that would connect the mob directly to the theft itself. The trail of the stolen art went completely cold. The 13 pieces, valued at $500 million, had vanished from the face of the earth. They did not surface on the international art market. No ransom demand was ever made. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. The FBI and the museum put up a multi-million-dollar reward for their safe return. But even that was not enough to break the silence. The art world, and the city of Boston, was left with a profound and aching sense of loss. The empty frames remained hanging on the walls of the Gardner Museum, a ghostly and permanent tribute to the stolen masterpieces, and a daily, public reminder of the greatest unsolved art heist in history. The thieves had not just stolen paintings. They had stolen a piece of the world's cultural heritage, leaving a permanent void that could never be filled. In the years following the heist, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum case settled into a long and frustrating period of dormancy, punctuated by brief, tantalizing glimmers of hope that would ultimately lead nowhere. The FBI investigation continued, but it was a case built on whispers, rumors, and the often unreliable testimony of criminal informants. The stolen artworks had been swallowed by the underworld, their whereabouts a closely guarded secret. The primary challenge for the investigators was not just finding the art, but penetrating the thick wall of silence that surrounded the Boston mob. The focus of the FBI's investigation for many years centered on the crew of a local mobster named Carmelo Merlino. Merlino was a career criminal, and his crew was known for armored car robberies and other heists. Investigators believed that Merlino's crew had either carried out the robbery themselves or had acquired the stolen art shortly after the fact. In 1997, the FBI seemed to be on the verge of a major breakthrough. They, along with the museum's head of security, a former FBI agent named Anthony Amore, arranged a meeting with a low-level career criminal named William "Billy" Youngworth. Youngworth claimed he had access to the stolen paintings and could broker their return. He even led investigators to a warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn, where he claimed the art was stored. The investigators were ecstatic, believing they were just hours away from recovering the masterpieces. But it was all a ruse. Youngworth was simply trying to use the promise of the art to get a friend out of prison and to collect the reward money. The lead went nowhere, another dead end in a case full of them. The FBI continued to apply pressure to the Merlino crew. In 1999, they arrested Merlino and several of his associates on unrelated charges of armored car robbery. The hope was that one of them, facing a long prison sentence, would finally break their silence and trade information about the Gardner art for a reduced sentence. But the mob's code of omerta held firm. No one talked. Carmelo Merlino died in prison in 2005, taking whatever secrets he had about the heist to his grave. As the years turned into decades, a new generation of investigators took over the case, and new theories began to emerge. The focus shifted to another group of local criminals, associates of the Merlino crew who were based in Connecticut. The FBI now believes that the two thieves who entered the museum that night were low-level mob associates, who then handed the art off to more senior, experienced criminals. In 2013, on the 23rd anniversary of the heist, the FBI made a stunning public announcement. For the first time, they officially identified the two men they believe were responsible for the theft. The men were George Reisfelder and Leonard DiMuzio, two known associates of the Carmelo Merlino crew. This was a monumental development. The phantoms who had walked out of the Gardner Museum finally had names, but the announcement was a bittersweet one. Both Reisfelder and DiMuzio had died of natural causes shortly after the heist, in 1991. They could never be brought to justice. The FBI also announced that they had a high degree of confidence that they knew where the art had traveled in the years after the theft. They believed it had been moved from Boston to Connecticut and then to the Philadelphia area, where it was offered for sale in the early 2000s. After that attempted sale, the trail went cold again. The FBI's announcement was a plea to the public. They made it clear that the statute of limitations for the theft itself had long since expired. No one could be prosecuted for the crime. Their only goal now was the recovery of the art. They offered a multi-million-dollar reward and immunity from prosecution to anyone who could facilitate the return of the stolen works. "We're not looking to charge anyone," the lead agent said. "We're just looking to get the art back." The announcement sparked a new wave of interest in the case and led to the identification of another key suspect, a man who many now believe was the mastermind behind the entire operation. His name was Robert "Bobby" Guarente, a seasoned mobster from Boston with ties to both the Connecticut and Philadelphia mafia. Guarente was a major player in the New England underworld. He died of cancer in 2004, but shortly before his death, he reportedly confessed his involvement to his wife, Eileen. According to Eileen, her husband had been in possession of at least some of the stolen art. He had given two of the paintings to another mob associate, a man named Robert "Bobby" the Cook Gentile, a low-level, aging gangster from Connecticut. This lead sent the FBI directly to the door of Bobby Gentile. Gentile, an elderly man in poor health, vehemently denied any knowledge of the paintings, but the FBI didn't believe him. They put him under intense pressure, raiding his home multiple times. In one raid, they found a secret ditch hidden beneath a false floor in his barn. The ditch was empty, but it was a tantalizing clue. In another raid, They found a copy of a newspaper article about the heist, with a handwritten note next to it detailing the potential market value of each of the stolen pieces. They also found a police uniform and police hat in his home. The circumstantial evidence against Gentile was mounting. The FBI was convinced he was the key, the man who knew where the art was hidden. They arrested him on unrelated gun charges, hoping to use the threat of a long prison sentence to force him to talk. But Bobby Gentile, like all the others, refused to cooperate. He insisted he knew nothing, that Guarente had been lying, that he was just a small-time bookie who had gotten caught up in something far beyond his control. He passed a polygraph test, but the FBI remained convinced he was lying. He was eventually sentenced on the gun charges, but he never gave up any information about the Gardner art. He died in 2021. Another secret keeper who took what he knew to the grave. The investigation had come so close, yet the art remained tantalizingly out of reach. The FBI had a credible theory of the crime. A local mob crew, led by figures like Carmelo Merlino and Bobby Guarente, had used low-level associates like Reisfelder and DiMuzio to carry out the heist. The art was then passed up the criminal food chain, a priceless bargaining chip that was held in secret for decades. But every person who had direct knowledge of the crime or the location of the art seemed to die before they could be forced to talk. The trail was a series of ghosts, a chain of secrets that had been passed from one dead man to the next. The greatest art treasure hunt in history had become a race against time, a desperate attempt to find the art before the last person who knew its location was gone forever. The investigation into the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist, now spanning more than 3 decades, has become a multi-generational saga of frustration, false hope, and enduring mystery. The FBI's official theory, that the crime was orchestrated by a Boston-based mafia crew and the art was passed through criminal networks in Connecticut and Philadelphia, remains the most plausible and well-supported narrative. Yet, despite this, not a single piece of the 13 stolen artworks has ever been recovered. The trail has gone cold, and the secrets of the heist are now buried with a generation of aging and deceased mobsters. The current reward for information leading directly to the recovery of the art in good condition stands at a staggering $10 million, the largest private reward ever offered for stolen property. The museum and the FBI have made it clear that they are not interested in prosecutions. Their sole focus is the return of the cultural treasures. This offer of amnesty and immense wealth is a powerful lure, yet it has failed to break the silence. This fact has led to a number of grim conclusions. The most likely and most tragic is that the art no longer exists in a recoverable state. It may have been destroyed in the years after the heist by panicked criminals who realized it was too famous to sell. It could have been damaged by improper storage, left to rot in a damp cellar or a humid attic, or it may have been divided and scattered across the globe, its pieces now hanging in the private, hidden collections of unscrupulous billionaires, forever lost to the public. The legacy of the heist is a profound and multifaceted one. For the art world, it is a wound that has never healed. The theft of Rembrandt's The Storm on the Sea of Galilee, his only known seascape, and Vermeer's The Concert, one of only a handful of the master's works in the world, represents an incalculable loss to human culture. These are not just valuable objects. They are irreplaceable pieces of our shared history. The brutal way the canvases were cut from their frames adds another layer of tragedy, a display of callous disregard for the work's artistic integrity. Inside the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, the legacy of the heist is a palpable, ghostly presence. In accordance with Isabella Stewart Gardner's will, which forbids any permanent change to the collection, the empty frames of the stolen masterpieces still hang on the walls of the Dutch room. They are not placeholders. They are memorials. They serve as a constant, haunting reminder of the loss, a testament to the art that once was and a symbol of the enduring hope for its return. For visitors to the museum, these empty frames are often the most powerful and poignant exhibit, a silent, powerful statement about what was taken from the world that night. The case has also become a cornerstone of true crime lore, a perfect crime that continues to fascinate and baffle. It has been the subject of countless books, documentaries, and podcasts, including the popular Netflix series, This Is a Robbery, the world's biggest art heist. Each new telling of the story brings a new wave of public interest and a new set of amateur detectives who believe they can solve the puzzle that has stumped the FBI for 30 years. The case is a masterclass in criminal audacity, a story that has all the elements of a Hollywood thriller. A daring plan, convincing disguises, a priceless treasure, and a perfect, vanishing act. But for the city of Boston and the investigators who have dedicated their lives to the case, the story is one of deep and abiding frustration. It is a tale of missed opportunities, of witnesses who died too soon, and of a criminal code of silence that proved to be unbreakable. It is a testament to the ability of organized crime to absorb even a $500 million treasure into its shadowy depths, making it vanish as if it had never existed. The likelihood of the art being recovered diminishes with each passing year. The men who knew the secret are almost all gone. The paintings and objects themselves, if they still exist, are likely hidden away, their vibrant colors fading in the darkness. But the hope remains. The $10 million reward is still active. The empty frames still hang on the walls, waiting. The FBI file, though largely inactive, remains officially open. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist is more than just an unsolved crime. It is a story about absence. It is about the void that is left behind when a piece of our shared culture is stolen, and the enduring collective desire to make it whole again. The 13 stolen objects are the art world's most famous ghosts. Their whereabouts a secret that has been kept for a generation. The heist was a crime of breathtaking audacity, a story of two men who, for 81 minutes, held the world's greatest art treasures in their hands, and then, like phantoms, walked out into the night, leaving behind a mystery that may never be solved. The Gardner heist was a crime of immense value, where priceless objects were the target. But sometimes the target is not an object, but a person, a figure of such global fame that their abduction becomes a drama that captivates the entire world. The Lindbergh kidnapping in the annals of American history, few names have ever radiated with the kind of pure, unadulterated heroism as that of Charles Augustus Lindbergh. In 1927, at the age of just 25, the handsome, soft-spoken aviator from Minnesota had accomplished the impossible. Flying solo in his tiny single-engine plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, he had made the first-ever non-stop transatlantic flight, from New York to Paris. The 33-hour journey was a feat of almost superhuman endurance and courage, and it transformed him overnight into the most famous man on Earth. He was the Lone Eagle, a global icon, a symbol of American ingenuity, bravery, and the limitless potential of the modern age. His fame was absolute, his face known to millions, his every move chronicled by a ravenous press. In 1929, he married Anne Morrow, the brilliant, shy, and thoughtful daughter of a U.S. diplomat. Together, they were the ultimate celebrity couple, America's royalty. But the relentless glare of the spotlight was a heavy burden. They craved a life of privacy and quiet domesticity, a sanctuary where they could raise their family away from the prying eyes of the world. In 1931, they found what they believed would be that sanctuary. They built a large, isolated home on a sprawling, 500-acre estate in the remote, rolling hills of Hopewell, New Jersey. It was a fortress of solitude, a place where they hoped to live a normal life. It was here, in this house built to keep the world out, that their first child, Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., was born. The press dubbed him the Eaglet, the beloved heir to America's greatest hero. The baby, a beautiful boy with his father's blonde hair and blue eyes, became the center of their world. But by the winter of 1932, the 20-month-old child was a little under the weather, suffering from a common cold. On the evening of Tuesday, March 1st, the routine of the household was dictated by the infant's needs. The night was cold and windy, the sound of the gale whistling through the pines that surrounded the isolated estate. At around 8 p.m., the baby's nurse, a woman named Betty Gow, rubbed a camphorated ointment on his chest, put him in his crib, and closed the shutters of the nursery window. Though she noted that one of the shutters was warped and couldn't be fully secured, Charles and Anne had dinner downstairs. At around 9 p.m., Charles Lindbergh, sitting in his study directly below the nursery, heard a strange, sharp crack, like a wooden box falling off a chair. It was a sound so distinct that he mentioned it to his wife. But in a house still settling on its foundations and buffeted by a strong wind, it was quickly dismissed. The family's Scottish terrier, Wagush, who normally barked at any unfamiliar sound, was quiet. At 10 p.m., Betty Gow went to check on the baby before retiring for the night. She entered the nursery and walked over to the crib. It was empty. A wave of confusion, followed by a surge of pure, cold terror, washed over her. She checked the bathroom, the closets. Nothing. She rushed downstairs to find Anne Lindbergh. "Do you have the baby?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," Anne replied. The two women rushed to Charles's study. "Charles," Anne cried, "they have stolen our baby." Charles Lindbergh, the man who had faced the vast emptiness of the Atlantic alone, was now faced with a new and more terrifying kind of void. He raced up the stairs to the nursery. The empty crib was a silent testament to the violation. He saw the open window, the one with the warped shutter, and on the floor beneath it, muddy footprints. The sanctuary had been breached. The world they had tried so desperately to keep at bay had come crashing in. Lindbergh grabbed a rifle and ran outside, searching the dark, wind-swept grounds, his calls for his son swallowed by the night. He found nothing. But back in the nursery, on the windowsill, police would find the first, chilling communication from the phantom who had stolen the most famous child in the world. It was a simple, white envelope. Inside was a crudely written ransom note. The note, penned in a strange, spidery script with numerous grammatical and spelling errors, was a bizarre mix of phonetic spelling and German sentence structure. It was clear it had been written by someone for whom English was a second language. The note was chillingly direct. It demanded a ransom of $50,000 in exchange for the safe return of the child. It warned the Lindberghs not to contact the police or the press, or the baby would be killed. And it was signed with a strange, interlocking symbol. Two blue circles intersecting with a solid red circle in the middle, and three small holes punched through the paper, a unique and cryptic signature. The news of the kidnapping, despite the kidnapper's warning, broke almost immediately and became the biggest story in the world. The crime was so audacious, so unthinkable, that it shocked the entire nation to its core. The lone eagle, the untouchable American hero, had been proven to be as vulnerable as any other man. The press descended on Hopewell, turning the quiet country estate into a chaotic media encampment. The investigation became a national obsession. A public drama played out on the front pages of every newspaper. The New Jersey State Police, under the command of Colonel H. Norman Schwarzkopf Sr., the father of the famous Gulf War general, took the lead on the case. They began a meticulous search of the grounds. Beneath the nursery window, they found two deep impressions in the soft, muddy earth, where a ladder had stood, and a short distance away, lying in the bushes, they found the ladder itself. It was a strange, homemade creation, a three-section extension ladder that was crudely but cleverly constructed. One of the sections was split, broken. This was likely the source of the sharp, cracking sound Charles Lindbergh had heard at 9 p.m. The sound of the ladder breaking as the kidnapper, carrying the 30-pound child, had made his descent. The ladder, along with the ransom note and the muddy footprints, were the only clues the kidnapper had left behind. The police were dealing with a ghost, a perpetrator who had demonstrated a strange and contradictory mix of careful planning and clumsy execution. He had successfully scouted the isolated home, built a custom ladder to reach the second-story window, and had entered and exited without alerting the family dog. But his ladder had broken, his note was poorly written, and he had left a trail of muddy footprints. Was he a sophisticated professional or a bumbling amateur who had gotten lucky? The police had no idea. The kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby was not just a crime. It was a national trauma. The entire country felt as if their own child had been stolen. The case would become known as the crime of the century, a 2.5-year saga of false leads, bizarre intermediaries, a desperate ransom payment, and a painstaking investigation that would push the boundaries of forensic science and forever change the American legal landscape. The hunt was on, not just for a kidnapper, but for a monster who had dared to touch a living legend. In the days and weeks following the abduction, the Lindbergh home in Hopewell was transformed into the nerve center of a massive, chaotic, and often contradictory investigation. The case was being handled by the New Jersey State Police, but the FBI offered its assistance, and Charles Lindbergh himself, using his immense influence and personal fortune, essentially ran a parallel, private investigation. The public's response was overwhelming. Thousands of letters, offering prayers, advice, and tips, poured in. The intense media scrutiny made a controlled investigation almost impossible, and the case quickly attracted a swarm of grifters, charlatans, and well-intentioned but misguided individuals, all hoping to insert themselves into the biggest story in the world. Charles Lindbergh, against the advice of the police, made the decision to cooperate with the kidnappers' demands. His only goal was the safe return of his son, and he was willing to pay any price. He used the newspapers to communicate with the kidnapper, placing ads that signaled his willingness to pay the $50,000 ransom. This public negotiation opened the door for a series of bizarre and ultimately fruitless encounters with individuals who claimed to be intermediaries for the kidnappers. The most prominent of these was a man named Dr. John F. Condon, a retired and eccentric school principal from the Bronx. Condon, writing under the pen name Jaffe, placed his own ad in a local newspaper, offering to act as a go-between. To everyone's astonishment, the kidnapper responded. This initiated a strange and protracted series of negotiations, conducted through coded messages in newspaper columns. The kidnapper, who identified himself only as John, proved his authenticity by mailing Dr. Condon the baby's sleeping suit, the very one he had been wearing on the night he was taken. The negotiations culminated in a dramatic, nighttime meeting in a Bronx cemetery. On the night of April 2, 1932, over a month after the kidnapping, Dr. Condon, following a series of intricate instructions, met with a man he believed to be John. The man had a distinct German accent and kept his face hidden in the shadows of the cemetery. Lindbergh himself was waiting in a car nearby, listening to the man's voice, trying to get a sense of the person who held his son's life in his hands. During this tense meeting, Dr. Condon handed over the $50,000 ransom, which was paid in gold certificates, a form of currency that was soon to be recalled from circulation, making the bills traceable. In exchange, John gave Condon a note revealing the supposed location of the baby. The note claimed the child was safe and being held on a boat named Nellie off the coast of Massachusetts. A wave of hope surged through the Lindbergh family and the nation. Charles Lindbergh, a skilled pilot, immediately took to the skies, personally flying over the coastal waters of Massachusetts, scouring the sea for any sign of the boat, Nellie. But the search was a heartbreaking failure. There was no boat. There was no child. The note had been a cruel, heartless deception. The ransom had been paid, but the baby was still gone. It was a devastating blow, and the grim realization began to set in that the child might not be alive at all. This horrifying suspicion was confirmed just over a month later. On May 12, 1932, about 72 days after the abduction, a truck driver named William Allen pulled over to the side of a road near Mount Rose, New Jersey, just a few miles from the Lindbergh estate. He walked a short distance into the woods to relieve himself. There, in a shallow, hastily dug grave, partially unearthed by recent rains and animal activity, he found the decomposing body of a small child. The police were called to the scene. The body was badly decomposed, but the clothing was recognizable. It was the body of Charles Lindbergh Jr. An autopsy revealed the tragic and brutal truth. The baby had a massive, fractured skull. The cause of death was a powerful blow to the head. The lone eagle's son had likely been killed on the very night of the kidnapping, his death possibly the result of an accidental fall when the homemade ladder broke during the kidnapper's descent from the nursery window. The entire ransom negotiation, the coded messages, the cemetery meeting. It had all been a ghoulish charade, a con being played by a man who knew the child was already dead. The news of the baby's death transformed the nation's grief into a furious, collective cry for justice. The crime of the century was no longer a kidnapping. It was a murder case. The investigation, which had been focused on rescue, now became a relentless manhunt for a child killer. The FBI, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, intensified its efforts. The primary focus was on tracking the ransom money. The serial numbers of all 2,500 gold certificates had been recorded. A massive public campaign was launched, with lists of the serial numbers published in newspapers and distributed to every bank in the country. The authorities were now waiting for the killer to make a mistake, to try and spend his blood money and, in doing so, reveal himself. But the killer was patient. For over 2 years, the trail of the ransom money went almost completely cold. A few of the bills surfaced sporadically, but they were impossible to trace back to a source. The investigation stalled. The homemade ladder became a key piece of evidence. A brilliant wood expert named Arthur Kohler was brought in to analyze it. In a remarkable feat of early forensic science, Kohler was able to trace the specific type of wood used in the ladder to a particular region of the country, and even identify the unique markings left by a dull saw blade at a specific lumberyard. But without a suspect to match the evidence against, it was a clue that led nowhere. The case remained in this frustrating state of limbo for 2 long years. The killer had vanished, and the ransom money seemed to have disappeared with him. The most famous crime in American history was on the verge of becoming its most famous unsolved mystery. But then, in the autumn of 1934, a single observant gas station attendant in the Bronx would notice a strange gold certificate, a note that would finally break the case wide open and lead the authorities directly to the door of the man who was, almost certainly, the Phantom of Hopewell. The net that had been cast 2.5 years earlier was finally about to be drawn tight. For 2.5 years, the Lindbergh case haunted the American public, a wound that refused to heal. The investigation, for all its massive scale, had ground to a halt. The killer had successfully extorted the ransom and vanished, leaving behind only a trail of heartbreak and a handful of baffling clues. The breakthrough, when it finally came, was not the result of a dramatic police raid or a clever piece of detective work, but of a simple, everyday transaction and the sharp eyes of a single vigilant citizen. On September 18, 1934, a man pulled into a gas station in the Bronx and paid for his gasoline with a $10 gold certificate. The gas station attendant, Walter Lyle, thought the bill was strange. Gold certificates were being rapidly withdrawn from circulation, and he had been warned by his boss to be on the lookout for them. Following instructions, he jotted down the license plate number of the man's car on the back of the bill before giving it to his manager. The manager, in turn, passed it on to the bank. A few days later, a bank teller processing the deposit noticed the gold certificate, checked its serial number against the list of the Lindbergh ransom money, and got a positive match. The alarm was raised. After 2 long years of silence, a piece of the blood money had finally surfaced with a traceable clue attached to it. The license plate number was traced to a blue Dodge sedan registered to a man named Richard Hauptmann. The address was 1279 East 222nd Street in the Bronx. The police immediately placed the house under intense surveillance. The man who lived there was a 35-year-old German immigrant, a carpenter with a criminal record in his home country. He fit the general profile. He was German, which would explain the accent Dr. Condon had heard in the cemetery, and he was a carpenter, which would explain his ability to construct the homemade ladder. On the morning of September 19, 1934, as Richard Hauptmann was leaving his home, the police moved in. He was arrested without incident. In his pocket, they found a $20 Lindbergh ransom bill. The net had finally closed. A subsequent search of Hauptmann's home and garage uncovered a treasure trove of damning evidence. Hidden in the walls of his garage, investigators found a staggering $14,600 of the ransom money, neatly stacked and wrapped. They found a handgun that was later linked to Hauptmann. And most compellingly, they found a section of flooring in his attic that was missing a board. The wood from this missing floorboard was a perfect match to the wood used to construct rail 16 of the homemade ladder found at the crime scene. The unique grain patterns and even the nail holes lined up perfectly. It was the forensic equivalent of a fingerprint. The evidence against Hauptmann was overwhelming, but he steadfastly denied any involvement. He claimed that the money had been left with him for safekeeping by a friend and business partner, a man named Isidor Fisch. He said Fisch had returned to Germany and had died there, leaving Hauptmann with the box of money, which he had only recently discovered. This Fisch story was the foundation of his defense, but it was a story that was flimsy and full of holes. Investigators could find little evidence of Fish's supposed wealth, and the story didn't explain the other pieces of evidence against him. The trial of Bruno Richard Hauptmann began in January of 1935 in Flemington, New Jersey. It was, without question, the trial of the century. The small town was overrun with reporters, celebrities, and curious members of the public. The trial was a media circus of unprecedented proportions. The prosecution, led by New Jersey Attorney General David T. Willans, laid out their case with methodical precision. They presented the massive cache of ransom money found in Hauptmann's garage. They brought in the wood expert, Arthur Kohler, who gave a brilliant and compelling testimony, demonstrating to the jury how the wood from Hauptmann's attic was a perfect match for the latter. They presented multiple handwriting experts who testified that the handwriting on the ransom notes was a match to Hauptmann's. The most emotional and powerful moments of the trial, however, came from the eyewitnesses. Dr. John Condon took the stand and, though he had previously been uncertain, he now positively identified Hauptmann as John, the man he had met with in the cemetery, and Charles Lindbergh himself, in a moment of riveting courtroom drama, took the stand. He testified that as he had sat in the car on that dark night, listening to the kidnapper's voice, he had heard a single, distinct phrase that had been burned into his memory. The man had said, "Doctor, we have the baby." Lindbergh told the jury that the voice he had heard that night was the voice of Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Hauptmann's defense team tried to discredit the witnesses and the evidence. They argued that the eyewitness identifications were unreliable, that the handwriting analysis was a subjective pseudoscience, and that the police had planted the evidence against their client. They put Hauptmann on the stand, where he continued to tell his convoluted fish story, but his testimony was not convincing. He was evasive, argumentative, and came across as deeply unsympathetic. On the stand, under a withering cross-examination from Attorney General Willans, his story began to fall apart. The trial lasted for 5 weeks. After the closing arguments, the case was handed to the jury. They deliberated for 11 hours. On February 13, 1935, they returned with a verdict. The courtroom was silent as the foreman announced their decision. Guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was mandatory. Death by electrocution. Bruno Richard Hauptmann had been convicted, but the story was still not over. He continued to maintain his innocence, and his case went through a lengthy and exhaustive appeals process. His supporters, and there were many, argued that he was a victim of a miscarriage of justice, a German immigrant who had been railroaded by a system that was desperate to close the biggest case in American history. They pointed to inconsistencies in the evidence, to the potential for police misconduct, and to the immense public pressure for a conviction. They argued that Hauptmann, while likely involved in the extortion, may not have been the kidnapper or the killer, and that he was part of a larger conspiracy. The debate over his guilt or innocence and the fairness of his trial continues to this day. But the courts were not swayed. His appeals were all denied. As Bruno Richard Hauptmann sat on death row, the legal and public battle over his fate raged on. His defense team fought desperately to save his life, filing appeal after appeal, all of which were denied. The governor of New Jersey, Harold Hoffman, a man who harbored his own doubts about Hauptmann's sole guilt, launched a last-minute independent investigation and even visited Hauptmann in his cell, trying to convince him to confess and reveal the names of his supposed accomplices in exchange for a commuted sentence. But Hauptmann was unyielding. To the very end, he refused to change his story. He would admit nothing, name no one, and insisted that he was an innocent man who had been framed. On the evening of April 3, 1936, more than 4 years after the kidnapping, Bruno Richard Hauptmann was led to the electric chair at the New Jersey State Prison. He walked to his death with a quiet, almost stoic, dignity. He offered no final confession, no last words of remorse or revelation. The switch was thrown, and the man convicted of the crime of the century was executed. His death, however, did not put an end to the questions that surrounded the case. For many, his execution was not the final chapter, but the beginning of a new, enduring mystery. Was he truly the lone monster who had planned and carried out the entire crime? Or was he, as he had claimed, a pawn in a larger conspiracy, a man who had been left holding the bag, who had gone to his death protecting the identities of his partners? The theory of a conspiracy has been one of the most persistent and compelling aspects of the Lindbergh case. The sheer number of strange and unanswered questions seems to point to a more complex story than the simple narrative presented at trial. Why did the family dog not bark? How could a single man, a carpenter with no known criminal accomplices in America, have pulled off such an audacious and complex crime? The ransom notes themselves, with their strange grammar and symbols, seem to be the work of more than one person. Some investigators, both then and now, believe that Hauptmann was part of a small group, perhaps 2 or 3 people, who had planned the kidnapping together. This would explain many of the inconsistencies in the case. Hauptmann's role might have been to build the ladder and launder the money, while others were responsible for the abduction and the communications. In this scenario, his refusal to confess was not a sign of his innocence, but a final act of loyalty to his partners in crime. The legacy of the Lindbergh kidnapping was profound and immediate. The crime and the media circus that surrounded it led to significant changes in American law. In response to the wave of copycat crimes and the jurisdictional nightmares of the multi-state investigation, Congress passed the Federal Kidnapping Act in 1932, popularly known as the Lindbergh Law. This act made kidnapping a federal offense, giving the FBI the authority to pursue kidnappers across state lines. The crime also had a devastating personal impact on the Lindberghs. Haunted by the tragedy and hounded by the relentless press, they fled the United States in 1935, seeking refuge and anonymity in Europe. They would not return to live in America permanently for several years. The crime of the century had destroyed their sanctuary and driven the nation's greatest hero into exile. The case also marked a pivotal moment in the history of forensic science. The painstaking work of the wood expert, Arthur Kohler, in tracing the ladder back to Hauptmann's attic was a landmark achievement in forensic analysis. It demonstrated the power of scientific evidence to solve crimes and set a new standard for future investigations. The case was a showcase for the emerging power of the FBI's new scientific crime laboratory. But the most enduring legacy of the Lindbergh kidnapping is its status as a great American tragedy. It is a story that has all the elements of a dark, mythic fable. A heroic father, a beautiful mother, a stolen child, a mysterious villain, and a desperate search for justice. It is a story that captured the soul of a nation that was already struggling with the profound anxieties of the Great Depression. The kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby felt like a violation of something sacred, an attack on the very idea of American innocence and security. If the son of the lone eagle was not safe, then who was? Today, the case continues to be a subject of intense debate and fascination. New books and documentaries continue to re-examine the evidence, proposing new theories and questioning the official narrative. Was Hauptmann truly guilty? Was he the sole perpetrator? Did Isidor Fish really exist, and was he involved? These are questions that will likely never be answered with absolute certainty. The truth is buried with the men who were there that night, with the secrets that were kept, and with the passage of time. The Lindbergh kidnapping remains a permanent and painful scar on the American psyche. It is a story of a family's unimaginable loss and a nation's collective trauma. It is a testament to the power of a single crime to shape a nation's laws, to define an era, and to create a mystery that will continue to haunt us. A tragic lullaby that never ends. The kidnapping of a single, famous child was a crime that horrified a nation. But some crimes are even more audacious, targeting not a person, but an entire system, turning the everyday act of taking medicine into a deadly game of Russian roulette. The kidnapping of Patty Hearst, the city of Berkeley, California, in the early months of 1974, was a place still echoing with the aftershocks of a cultural revolution. The idealism of the 1960s had soured, giving way to a more fractured and militant radicalism. The air was thick with the rhetoric of revolution, and the Bay Area was a chaotic ecosystem of small, often violent, political splinter groups, each with its own manifesto and its own deep-seated rage against the system. But for the most part, this world of revolutionary fervor existed far from the quiet, privileged lives of the city's elite. For a 19-year-old art history student at the University of California, Berkeley, this world was little more than background noise, a distant political theater that had nothing to do with her life of quiet study and domestic comfort. Her name, however, was a symbol, a lightning rod for the very system these groups despised. Her name was Patricia Campbell Hearst. Patty Hearst was more than just a college student. She was American royalty. She was the granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst, the legendary newspaper magnate and one of the most powerful and controversial figures of the 20th century. She was an heiress to a media empire, a young woman born into a world of unimaginable wealth and privilege. But by all accounts, Patty herself was a quiet, unassuming figure. She was living a peaceful, almost mundane life in a comfortable Berkeley apartment with her fiancé, a 26-year-old philosophy graduate student named Stephen Weed. Her life was one of academic pursuits, wedding plans, and the gentle, predictable rhythms of a well-funded, upper-class existence. She was a symbol of the establishment, but she was not a part of its power structure. She was simply a young woman in love, planning her future. On the night of Monday, February 4th, 1974, that future was shattered. Patty and Stephen were relaxing in their apartment, watching television. The evening was quiet and unremarkable. At around 9 p.m., there was a knock at the door. Patty, thinking it was a neighbor, went to answer it. As she opened the door, she was confronted by a scene of sudden, terrifying violence. A small group of armed individuals, both men and women, forced their way into the apartment. One woman was white, the others were a black man and woman. The scene descended into chaos. The intruders were professional and brutal. They grabbed Patty, who was dressed only in a bathrobe. Stephen Weed tried to intervene, to protect his fiancée, and was viciously beaten with a wine bottle. His head split open. He was then bound and gagged. A neighbor who heard the commotion and came to see what was happening was also beaten. The intruders dragged a screaming, blindfolded Patty from the apartment, bundled her into the trunk of a waiting car, and sped off into the night. The entire abduction was a swift, violent, and paramilitary operation. It was over in a matter of minutes. When the police arrived, they found a scene of confusion and terror. Stephen Weed, bleeding and disoriented, could offer little in the way of a description. The neighbors had seen a car, but not much else. The only physical evidence the kidnappers had left behind was a single, spent shell casing and a profound sense of shock. The granddaughter of William Randolph Hearst had been violently abducted from her own home. The news of the kidnapping became an instant national sensation. The FBI immediately took over the case, launching a massive investigation. The initial assumption was that this was a traditional kidnapping for ransom, the work of a professional criminal gang looking to extort a fortune from the wealthy Hearst family. But this was not an ordinary criminal enterprise. 2 days after the abduction, a local radio station, KPFA, a station known for its leftist political leanings, received a letter. It was a communiqué, a political manifesto from a group no one had ever heard of before. They called themselves the Symbionese Liberation Army, or the SLA. The SLA was a bizarre, newly formed revolutionary cell, a tiny, self-styled urban guerrilla army composed of a handful of radicalized students and ex-convicts. Their leader was a man named Donald DeFreeze, an escaped convict who had adopted the name and persona of General Field Marshal Cinque Mtum. The group's ideology was a confused and volatile cocktail of black nationalism, Maoist rhetoric, and a deep-seated, violent hatred for what they called the capitalist corporate state. Their symbol was a 7-headed cobra. They were a small, deeply delusional, and incredibly dangerous group who had, just a few months prior, committed their first political act, the assassination of the Oakland school superintendent, Marcus Foster, a crime they had carried out with cyanide-tipped bullets. In their first communiqué, the SLA announced that they were holding Patty Hearst not as a hostage for ransom, but as a prisoner of war. They declared that she was a member of the ruling class, a pig, who was being held accountable for the crimes of her family and the capitalist system they represented. They were not interested in money for themselves. Their demands were far stranger and more ambitious. A few days later, another communique arrived, this time accompanied by an audio tape. On it, for the first time since her abduction, the world heard the voice of Patty Hearst. She sounded terrified, her voice strained and shaky. She stated her name and confirmed that she was a prisoner of the SLA. She then read a prepared statement from her captors. Their demand was not for a cash ransom to be paid to them, but for a massive, unprecedented act of good faith from the Hearst family. They demanded that her father, Randolph Hearst, fund a program to provide $70 worth of free, high-quality food to every single needy person in the state of California. The program was to be called Food for the People. The demand was staggering, a logistical and financial impossibility. It would cost an estimated $400 million. It was not a ransom demand. It was a piece of political theater, a way for the SLA to position themselves as champions of the poor and to cast the Hearst family as the greedy, uncaring face of capitalism. The FBI and the Hearst family were now faced with a new and terrifying kind of adversary, a group of ideologically driven terrorists who were not interested in a simple transaction, but in a public war of symbols. The life of Patty Hearst now hung in the balance, a pawn in a bizarre and violent game being played by a self-proclaimed revolutionary army that had emerged from the radical fringes of the American underground. The quiet art history student was now at the center of a national media storm, her fate tied to a demand that was as impossible as it was insane. The Symbionese Liberation Army's demand for a massive food giveaway placed Randolph Hearst in an impossible position. The FBI advised against it, arguing that acquiescing to the demands of terrorists would only encourage more violence. But Hearst's only concern was the life of his daughter. In a desperate attempt to show good faith, he announced that he would do what he could. He took out a $2 million loan and established an organization called People in Need to begin distributing food. The program was an immediate and catastrophic failure. The food giveaways, held in impoverished neighborhoods across the Bay Area, quickly descended into chaos. The demand far outstripped the supply. Crowds grew unruly, riots broke out, and the distributions were often halted by violence. The SLA, watching the chaos unfold, was not satisfied. They issued another communique, denouncing the food program as a pathetic, crumbs-on-the-table gesture. They declared that Randolph Hearst's effort was insufficient and that their prisoner of war, Patty, would remain in their custody. The attempt at negotiation had failed completely. The Hearst family was left in a state of agonizing helplessness, their daughter still a captive of a group that seemed to have no clear or achievable goal other than generating chaos. While this public drama was playing out, a far more intense and terrifying drama was unfolding in the secret, squalid hideouts of the SLA. For the first 57 days of her captivity, Patty Hearst was subjected to a brutal and systematic campaign of psychological and physical torment. She was kept locked in a dark, narrow closet, often blindfolded, her world reduced to a space no bigger than a coffin. She was repeatedly threatened, interrogated, and subjected to relentless political indoctrination. The SLA members, particularly their leader, Donald DeFreeze, would lecture her for hours on end, bombarding her with their bizarre, revolutionary ideology. They were not just holding her prisoner. They were trying to break her. They were attempting to deconstruct her entire identity as a privileged ruling class heiress and to rebuild her in their own image. She was sexually assaulted by DeFreeze and another male member of the group, an act of violence that was framed not as a violation, but as a revolutionary act, a way of liberating her from her bourgeois past. She was sleep-deprived, malnourished, and in a constant state of terror. It was a classic textbook case of brainwashing, a systematic assault on a person's sense of self, designed to induce a state of complete dependency and compliance. For weeks, Patty resisted, but the constant fear, the isolation, and the relentless indoctrination began to take their toll. Her identity, the very foundation of who she was, began to crumble. She was cut off from everyone and everything she had ever known, her entire reality now defined by the voices of her captors. Then, on April 3, 1974, 59 days after her abduction, the SLA released another audio tape to the world. And this one was a bombshell. The voice on the tape was still Patty Hearst's, But it was different. The fear and confusion were gone, replaced by a cold, hard, revolutionary fervor. In a flat, almost robotic monotone, she announced that she had made a decision. She was not going to be exchanged or released. She was joining them. She announced that she had adopted a new name, a nom de guerre, befitting her new identity. She would now be known as Tanya, a name chosen in honor of the revolutionary comrade of Che Guevara. She then proceeded to deliver a blistering, prepared statement, denouncing her family, her fiancé, and the entire capitalist corporate state they represented. She called her father a pig and referred to her former life as a part of the fascist insect that preys upon the life of the people. She declared her unwavering loyalty to the Symbionese Liberation Army and its goals. The message was clear and shocking. Patty Hearst, the heiress, the victim, had become Tanya, the revolutionary. The public and the authorities were stunned. Was this a genuine conversion? Had she, through some bizarre and terrifying process, come to embrace the ideology of her captors? Or was this simply a desperate act of survival, a young woman saying what she needed to say to stay alive, a classic case of Stockholm Syndrome, where a captive begins to identify with their captors as a psychological defense mechanism? The FBI and her family clung to the latter explanation. They saw her as a victim of coercive persuasion, a puppet mouthing the words of her tormentors. But the SLA was about to provide the world with horrifying visual proof that this was no mere act. On the morning of April 15, 1974, just 12 days after the Tanya tape was released, the Hibernia Bank in the Sunset District of San Francisco was robbed. A group of armed individuals stormed the bank, firing their weapons into the ceiling and ordering everyone to the floor. The robbery was captured on the bank's security cameras. The footage was grainy and black and white, but it showed 4 figures, all armed with automatic weapons. And one of them was unmistakably Patty Hearst. There she was, Tanya, brandishing a machine gun, her face set in a hard, determined expression. She can be heard on the audio, shouting commands to the bank customers, her voice full of a cold, revolutionary anger. The SLA had not just issued a press release. They had staged a public debut for their newest and most famous member. The robbery was a success. They made off with over $10,000. But more importantly, it was a profound and shocking statement. The image of the kidnapped heiress transformed into a machine gun-toting bank robber was seared into the national consciousness. It was a picture that defied all easy explanation. Was she a brainwashed victim, forced to participate at gunpoint? Or was she a willing, enthusiastic convert, a bored rich girl who had finally found the sense of purpose and rebellion she had been looking for? The line between victim and perpetrator had been completely, terrifyingly, blurred. Patty Hearst was no longer just a missing person. She was now one of America's most wanted fugitives, a member of a violent terrorist cell, and the central, enigmatic figure in a crime story that was getting stranger and more violent by the day. The Hibernia Bank robbery transformed the Patty Hearst case from a bizarre kidnapping into a full-blown national crisis. The image of the Tanya persona, armed and dangerous, was now plastered across every newspaper and television screen in the country. The FBI, which had been treating the case as a kidnapping, now had to shift its focus. Patty Hearst was no longer just a victim to be rescued. She was a fugitive to be apprehended. The manhunt for the Symbionese Liberation Army, which had been a regional affair, now became one of the most intense and high-profile pursuits in the Bureau's history. For the next month, the SLA, with their famous new recruit in tow, successfully went to ground. They moved between a series of safe houses in the Bay Area, reveling in their newfound notoriety and planning their next move. But their ranks were small and their methods were amateurish. They were a group of deeply delusional individuals playing a deadly game of revolution, and it was only a matter of time before they made a critical mistake. That mistake came on May 16, 1974. 2 members of the SLA, William and Emily Harris, were caught shoplifting a bandolier from a sporting goods store in Inglewood, a suburb of Los Angeles. When a security guard confronted them, a struggle ensued. Patty Hearst, who had been waiting outside in a van, opened fire with a machine gun, spraying the front of the store with bullets and allowing the Harrises to escape. The trio fled, abandoning their van and hijacking several other vehicles as they made their chaotic getaway. But they had left a crucial clue behind in the abandoned van. A parking ticket from a few days earlier. The ticket was from a street in a working-class neighborhood in south-central Los Angeles. The FBI now had a general location for the SLA's new hideout. The next day, May 17, 1974, the Los Angeles Police Department, acting on a tip from a local resident, surrounded a small, unassuming house at 1466 East 54th Street. The house was the SLA's new safe house. The police did not know at the time that Patty Hearst and the Harises were not inside. They had relocated to another hideout in Anaheim after the botched shoplifting incident. But 6 other core members of the SLA, including their leader, Donald General Sink DeFreeze, were in the house. What followed was one of the most intense and widely televised shootouts in American history. For hours, the nation was transfixed by the live broadcast of a full-scale urban gun battle. The LAPD, numbering in the hundreds, surrounded the small house. The 6 SLA members inside, armed with a small arsenal of automatic weapons, refused to surrender. They believed they were making a final, glorious stand against the fascist insect, a revolutionary battle that would be broadcast to the world. A furious gunfight erupted, with thousands of rounds of ammunition being exchanged. The small stucco house was ripped apart by the barrage of police bullets. The siege reached its fiery climax as the police began to launch tear gas canisters into the house. One of the canisters ignited a fire, and the entire structure was quickly engulfed in flames. The 6 SLA members inside, including General Sink, were all killed, either by the police gunfire or by the inferno that consumed the house. The Symbionese Liberation Army, as an organization, had been effectively annihilated in a single televised spectacle of violence. The nation watched, assuming that Patty Hearst had perished in the flames along with her captors. But as the smoke cleared and the bodies were identified, the authorities realized that she, along with William and Emily Harris, had not been in the house. They were still at large. The 3 remaining members of the SLA were now the most wanted fugitives in America. For the next year and a half, Patty Tanya Hearst lived the life of a revolutionary on the run. She was no longer a prisoner. She was an active and willing participant in the group's criminal activities. The trio, joined by a few new recruits, moved across the country, from California to the East Coast and back again. They were a ghost-like presence, always one step ahead of the law. During this period, they committed another bank robbery, this time in Carmichael, a suburb of Sacramento. During this robbery, a woman, a customer in the bank, was shot and killed. Though Patty herself did not fire the fatal shot, she was now an accomplice to murder. The line between victim and perpetrator had been completely erased. The arguments about whether she was a brainwashed puppet or a willing convert seemed to have been answered. Her actions as a fugitive, her participation in the bank robberies, her continued espousal of revolutionary rhetoric, all pointed to a woman who had, for whatever reason, fully embraced the identity of Tanya. She was no longer Patricia Campbell Hearst, the quiet art history student. She was a soldier in a war of her own making. But the life of a fugitive is a lonely and paranoid one. The revolutionary glamour quickly faded, replaced by the grim reality of constantly looking over one's shoulder. The small, fractured group was running out of money and safe houses. The massive FBI manhunt was relentless, the net slowly but surely tightening around them. The end came on September 18, 1975, 19 months after she had first been taken from her Berkeley apartment. Acting on a tip, FBI agents surrounded a small apartment in San Francisco. They kicked in the door and found Patty Hearst and another SLA member, Wendy Yoshimura. This time, there was no shootout, no final, glorious stand. Patty Hearst, the revolutionary fugitive known as Tanya, surrendered without a fight. When asked for her occupation during the booking process, she gave a single, defiant answer: urban guerrilla. Her capture was the end of one of the most bizarre and sensational crime sagas in American history, but it was the beginning of another equally complex chapter, the trial of Patty Hearst. The central question that had captivated the nation for nearly 2 years would now be put to the legal test. Was the woman they had captured the tragic, brainwashed victim, Patricia Hearst? Or was she the willing, violent terrorist, Tanya? The battle for her identity and her future was about to begin in a court of law. The trial of Patty Hearst, which began in January of 1976, was a legal and psychological spectacle that captivated the nation. The central question before the court was one of identity and intent. The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney James L. Browning, Jr., sought to portray Patty as a willing and enthusiastic participant in the SLA's crimes. They presented the evidence of her own words and actions. The Tanya tapes, her defiant urban guerrilla statement upon arrest, and most damningly, the clear footage of her brandishing a weapon during the Hibernia bank robbery. They argued that she was a bored, rebellious rich girl who had found a sense of purpose and adventure in the SLA's violent ideology. In their view, she was not a victim, but a common criminal who should be held fully accountable for her actions. The defense, led by the renowned and flamboyant defense attorney F. Lee Bailey, constructed a radical and groundbreaking argument. They claimed that Patty was not responsible for her actions because she had been the victim of a systematic campaign of torture and brainwashing. Bailey brought in a series of expert psychiatrists who testified about the effects of what would come to be known as coercive persuasion or Stockholm Syndrome. They argued that the 57 days she spent locked in a dark closet, subjected to constant fear, abuse, and indoctrination, had resulted in a complete and involuntary ideological conversion. Her personality had been shattered, they claimed, and the persona of Tanya was not a choice, but a survival mechanism, a new identity she had been forced to adopt to endure an unimaginable trauma. They argued that she was a classic victim of brainwashing, no more responsible for her actions than a prisoner of war who had been forced to collaborate with the enemy. Patty herself took the stand in her own defense. She presented a picture of a terrified young woman who had been brutalized and broken. She described the abuse she had suffered in detail, but her performance on the stand was not entirely convincing. Under a withering cross-examination, she came across as cold, detached, and at times argumentative. She seemed unable to fully articulate the psychological trauma she had endured, and her memory of key events was vague. The jury was left with a confusing and contradictory portrait. Was this the detached demeanor of a traumatized victim, or the evasive performance of a guilty woman? After a long and sensational trial, the jury made its decision. They rejected the brainwashing defense. They found Patty Hearst guilty of bank robbery. She was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. The verdict was a shock to many who saw her as a victim, but a validation to those who saw her as a willing terrorist. The line between victim and perpetrator had been legally decided, but the moral and psychological ambiguity of her case would continue to be debated for decades. Patty Hearst served 22 months of her sentence. Her case continued to be a cause célèbre, with a wide range of public figures, from conservative politicians to liberal activists, calling for her release. They argued that she had been a victim first, and that her imprisonment was a miscarriage of justice. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter, swayed by the public outcry and the unique circumstances of her case, commuted her sentence, and she was released from prison. She had been punished for her crimes, but the question of her true culpability remained. In the years that followed, Patty Hearst made a remarkable and surreal journey back into the world she had once so violently renounced. She married her former bodyguard, settled into a quiet, suburban life, and raised a family. She wrote a memoir, Every Secret Thing, in which she detailed the horror of her ordeal and maintained that her actions as Tanya were the result of brainwashing. She even became an actress, making a series of cameo appearances in the quirky, satirical films of director John Waters, a choice that seemed to be a knowing, ironic commentary on her own bizarre and sensational public life. The final chapter of her legal saga came in 2001, on the last day of his presidency. President Bill Clinton granted Patricia Campbell Hearst a full and unconditional presidential pardon. It was the official legal absolution she had sought for decades, a final recognition that she was, in the eyes of the state, a victim who had been forced to commit crimes under extreme duress. The legacy of the Patty Hearst case is a complex and enduring one. It was a story that seemed to capture all the chaotic, contradictory energies of the 1970s. the violent death of 60s radicalism, the public's fascination with celebrity, and a national debate about crime, responsibility, and the nature of identity itself. It introduced the concept of Stockholm Syndrome into the popular consciousness, forcing a conversation about the complex psychological effects of trauma and captivity. Was Patty Hearst a brainwashed victim or a willing revolutionary? The truth is likely a messy and uncomfortable combination of both. She was a young woman who was undeniably the victim of a brutal and terrifying crime. But she was also, it seems, a person who, in the crucible of that trauma, found a new, powerful, and for a time compelling identity as Tanya. Her story is a testament to the terrifying fragility of the human psyche, a demonstration of how a person's identity can be deconstructed and rebuilt under extreme pressure. She remains a uniquely American enigma, a figure who is simultaneously a victim, a perpetrator, a symbol, and a survivor, a woman whose life became a strange and violent piece of performance art that held a nation captive. The story of Patty Hearst was a saga of a single, famous individual whose personal trauma became a public spectacle. But some crimes are not about a single person. They are about a collective, a group of people who choose to step outside of society and, in the name of faith, create a new world that will ultimately lead them to a tragic, self-inflicted end.